All right, let's dive into the incredibly complex world of strokes. Now, you've probably heard how serious a stroke can be, right? But have you ever stopped to wonder why it hits people so differently? One person might lose the ability to speak while someone else can't move their leg. How on earth is that possible?
That really is the big question we're going to tackle today. How can the exact same type of event, a stroke, lead to such a huge variety of outcomes? Well, the answer isn't about the what. It's all about the where. So here's our game plan. We're going to start with the golden rule. For strokes, location is everything. Then we'll take a tour of the brain's two major circulatory systems. We'll also see what happens when the supercritical brainstem gets hit. And finally, we'll put all the pieces together to answer that big question.
Okay, let's kick things off with the single most important concept for understanding strokes. The symptoms a person gets are almost entirely decided by exactly where that stroke happens inside the brain.
I want you to think of your brain's blood supply like a super intricate highway map. All the different arteries are the highways, and each one is responsible for delivering essential fuel, oxygen, and nutrients to very specific neighborhoods. And these neighborhoods are highly specialized parts of the brain. A stroke? Well, that's just a roadblock suddenly popping up on one of those highways.
And this, right here, this is basically our guide for the whole journey. This chart lays it all out for us. You can see it's got three columns. The artery, that's our highway. The area of lesion, that's the neighborhood it supplies. And the symptoms, that's what goes wrong when that neighborhood supply line gets cut off.
Now, to make this map a little easier to read, we can split it into two main territories, each fed by a different superhighway system. You've got the anterior circulation, which handles the front and top parts of the brain, and then you have the posterior circulation, taking care of the back and lower regions. So, let's start our tour up front.
Welcome to the anterior circulation. This network is a real powerhouse. It runs some of the brain functions you're most familiar with, things like voluntary movement, your sense of touch, and for most of us, language.
So our first stop, if a roadblock pops up in the anterior cerebral artery, it mostly messes with the parts of the brain that control your leg. This leads to what's called contralateral paralysis, which is just a fancy way of saying the weakness and numbness show up on the opposite side of the body from where the stroke occurred. It can also, interestingly, cause urinary incontinence.
Okay, now we're on a major interstate, the middle cerebral artery, or MCA. A stroke here affects the brain areas that control your arm and face. But here's where it gets really fascinating. It also supplies our language centers, the famous Broca's and Wernicke's areas. So, if an MCA stroke hits the brain's dominant hemisphere, which is the left side for most people, it can cause something called aphasia.
And this slide just perfectly shows how specialized the brain is. I mean, look at this. A stroke in the MCA on the dominant left side often leads to aphasia, trouble with language. But a stroke in the exact same artery on the non-dominant right side, you get something totally different, hemineglect, where a person might completely ignore one side of their own body or the world around them.
And just so we're all on the same page, aphasia has nothing to do with the person's intelligence. It's literally a disruption in the brain's language hardware. It can mess with speaking, understanding, reading, writing, all because that one specific neighborhood lost its blood flow.
All right, time to head to the back of the brain and check out our second major territory, the posterior circulation. You can think of this system as running the brain's back office. It's in charge of things like our vision and a bunch of other absolutely vital operations.
First stop back here is the posterior cerebral artery. This one feeds the occipital lobe, which is basically vision headquarters for the brain. So, you guessed it, a stroke here causes a very specific kind of vision loss. It's called contralateral hemianopia, which means you lose the same half of your vision in both eyes. The macular sparing part is a strange little quirk where, often, the very center of your vision stays intact.
And the level of specialization here is just incredible. Depending on the exact spot, a stroke in this artery can cause prosopagnosia, the inability to recognize familiar faces. I mean, can you imagine looking at someone you love and not knowing who they are? All from one tiny roadblock? It can also cause really unique paralysis patterns, like Weber syndrome, which hits certain eye muscles on one side and the body on the other.
Now, we've arrived at a very critical junction, the basilar artery. This artery supplies the brainstem, the absolute command center for our most basic life functions. A blockage here can be just catastrophic. It can lead to quadriplegia and the loss of nearly all voluntary movement from the eyes down. But look at that last detail.
consciousness is spared.
This condition has a name that is just chillingly accurate: locked-in syndrome. The person is fully awake, fully aware, their mind is completely intact, but they are trapped inside a body that can no longer move or speak. It's maybe the most profound example of how a stroke's location is everything.
Let's just stay in this critical region for another moment. The brainstem is tiny, but a stroke here can trigger a whole cascade of system failures, just because it controls so many of our body's automatic background functions.
Take one last example, the pica. A stroke in this little artery causes a very specific collection of symptoms we call Wallenberg syndrome. You see things like trouble swallowing, intense dizziness, vomiting. This all happens because this one artery feeds the nerve centers that manage our balance, our gag reflex, and a whole host of other automatic jobs. It's a whole mess of problems, all from one tiny blockage.
And check this out. We can actually see what this looks like. All those symptoms we just went through on the chart, they all come from this. That bright white spot the arrow is pointing to on the MRI, that's the lesion. That is the physical proof of the roadblock on the brain's map.
So, after our big tour through the brain's highways and byways, from the front lobes all the way down to the brainstem, we can finally pull everything together and decode the damage.
We started this whole thing by asking why a stroke can cause such wildly different outcomes. Paralysis in one person, blindness in another. What's the one big idea that explains it all? Well, the first part of the answer is this. The brain is not just one big blob of tissue. It's an absolute masterpiece of specialization. It has distinct regions that are precisely engineered for very specific jobs. One area for moving your leg, another for seeing red, and yet another for understanding what I'm saying right now.
And that brings us to the final, most important point. Every stroke has a story, and that story is written entirely by its location. The specific artery that gets blocked determines the precise piece of brain that gets damaged, and that region's unique job dictates the symptoms. It's not random at all. It's a direct, logical consequence of the brain's own incredible, intricate map.